All right, students, with this section of Chapter 18, we will finally wrap up the Civil War. I will do this in two small screencasts instead of one giant long one. All right, by 1864, Scott's Great Snake was practically completed. Grant had shown himself to be an outstanding leader, and so Lincoln tapped him to be put in charge of the army. And so that meant he had to leave the Western Front and go over, hop a train with his guys and go back there towards the east in Virginia and start chasing Lee around, which is sort of basically what happened. That's what they call Grant's Virginia Campaign, is a series of small battles in Virginia. Well, not small. None of the battles were small, but not major turning point battles, but a series of battles in Virginia. Again, there were politician and aristocratic types in D.C. that they don't like Grant. Grant is not highly educated. He's not one of their social circle, and he's a soldier. He's a drinker and a brawler, and they make mention of this to Lincoln, and Lincoln is like, whatever kind of drink, alcohol he's drinking, I need more of it for the rest of the generals because he actually gets something done here. All right, so Grant has his own plan. It's a sub-part or a subset of Scott's Great Snake, and he knows he has to leave the southern western area, and he puts a man named Sherman in charge. And he expects Sherman to sweep across the South and take over Atlanta specifically, because Atlanta is a railroad hub. It's a transportation hub for the South. They don't have a lot of railroads, but the railroads they do have, most of them run through Atlanta. And in fact, current day airlines, lots of them run through Atlanta. And it's not a coincidence. It's not by accident. In the meantime, as I said, Grant hops on a train with most of his men, and they go back east, and they start something called his Virginia Campaign. And these battles right here in the fourth bullet point are the ones that are included in that. Battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. The map I have at the bottom with Cold Harbor in it, I've got that on there specifically to, again, explain to you that while World War I is famous for trench warfare wasn't invented in World War I. Most people say that's where it was invented, but they began using it way sooner than that. And you can see by the straight lines on the map there that some of these, there were trenches used at Cold Harbor. Not that that's what straight lines always mean, but in this case, at Cold Harbor, they were trenched in some of these places. All right, at every one of those battles mentioned, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Wilderness, and Cold Harbor, Lee's men would fight well and hard, and they would put up a good front at first, but Grant was overwhelming force. He had more men, he had more weapons, he had more of everything. And so Lee's men would fight for a while, and then would have to break and retreat. And then they would meet Grant again at the next spot, and they would fight for a few days and then break and retreat. And that's why they call it Grant's Virginia Campaign, because it was a series of battles where he engaged with Lee and his men, never completely finishing them off, because Lee would retreat and then meet him again in another spot. And unlike McClellan, Grant is not about to let Lee get away. He is going to finish him off eventually. However, in the space of 30 days, Grant lost 50,000 of his troops. And again, the critics in D.C. go insane, as we all would. We would never accept this type of casualties in modern day. We would never accept this. And Lincoln just simply says, I can't help it. I can't spare him. He's getting the job done, and we're going to continue on down this road. The last major huge battle was Petersburg, and it's near Richmond. And instead of addressing this head on, Grant laid siege to the city, much like he did at Vicksburg. And so he winds this up less with a frontal attack on Lee, as more than a starve them out kind of tactic. All right, so while Grant is doing all of this, Sherman is busy marching across the South. And I cannot stress how bad it was. I can't make it worse than it was, okay? Lincoln is running for re-election at this point in time, and you would think that he would simply be reelected with no problem whatsoever. But people were not happy with how he was running this war. And he had a challenger, which I will talk about in a minute. But he needed some victories. And Grant was doing okay in Virginia, but he still had not finished Lee off. So he's kind of depending on some other good news, and he's not getting any just yet. And Sherman is not having a completely easy time of it in Atlanta because a Confederate general, and you need to know that he's a Confederate general, John Bell Hood, was in his way in the city of Atlanta, and he's defending Atlanta. So Sherman does what worked for Grant. He lays the city under siege. He just simply doesn't try to attack him head on. He just encircles the city with his troops and just keeps on bombarding it. And these are pictures I have on here, actual photographs of what Atlanta looked like after Sherman had gotten done with it and actually ripping up railroad tracks and whatnot. So by September, now it's July, okay, and it takes him until September, but by September, Hood and his men abandoned Atlanta, and when Sherman rolled into Atlanta, he sent word to Washington, D.C., and of course it gets out in all the newspapers that he has control of Atlanta, and this is a huge victory for the North, and it helps Lincoln get reelected because people now see that, oh, maybe Lincoln is doing okay. Maybe he actually does have things under control. And we did vote for him once after all, so let's vote for him again. So it really, truly helps Lincoln get reelected. Also, Sherman set about systematically burning Atlanta to the ground, as much of it as he could. And he didn't stop with Atlanta. In addition to that, Lincoln got further good news from Admiral Farragut. Now, he had already captured New Orleans, but another important port in the South is Mobile Bay. There are, you can see by the map up here, right here, this is Mobile Bay. There's a small space of water right here where ships go in and out, even now, to this day. And there is a fort on this side and a fort on this side. This is Fort Morgan. This is Fort Gaines. Those forts were put in place there to help defend against the British in the War of 1812. But of course now the Confederates occupy that space. And Farragut wants to take them out. And he does. Now, this is not anything you're going to be tested on. But this little saying at the bottom, in the torpedoes, full steam ahead, you need to understand that torpedoes are not coming out of submarines at this point in time. The torpedoes were metal objects stuffed up with explosives that were anchored in Mobile Bay. Think of them as mines, okay? Like you think of as mines today that they lay for ships, but they didn't call them mines back then. They called them torpedoes because they anchored these things with anchors so that if a ship pulled in over the top of them, they would hit them and they would explode just like a mine does in the water. Okay, and Farragut knows they're in there, but he's like, no, we don't care. We're going in anyway. And there really aren't that many of them. And so he does capture Mobile Bay. But that's where that famous saying comes from. And again, I don't expect you'll be tested on it. I don't expect it'll show up on the star even. But it's a saying that is common in our language and in our speaking that you might hear. And I thought you might want to know where it came from. All right, let's talk about the election of 1864. So between the news of Sherman taking Atlanta and then Farragut taking Mobile Bay, as you can see, all those red states go for Lincoln. Now, the gray states don't matter because those are the Confederacy. That's a different country now. The only states that don't vote for Lincoln are little blue Kentucky and blue New Jersey. Now, who was Lincoln's challenger? None other than George McClellan. So the Democratic challenger was the same guy that Lincoln fired because he was incompetent on the battlefield. Initially, you look at that and you think, well, McClellan was a stupid choice for them because he was obviously not very good at his job. But if you're the Democrats, you choose him because he does have some experience in a war. He does have some experience commanding men. So he wasn't a terrible choice. And maybe even if they hadn't gotten good news from Sherman and from Farragut, maybe he would have taken more states. I think Lincoln probably still would have won the election at the end of the day. But I had to imagine that Lincoln probably was smiling pretty big at that night. And it was more than just an election, and this is the most important thing. If you looked at that map, remember the map, it's all red. People interpret this as a go-ahead for the 13th Amendment. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was just nothing more than a presidential decree, a presidential order. All presidents make those. President Trump has made them, President Obama before him, President Bush before him. A presidential order only is effective while the man is president, because then the very next person who comes into office can undo them. And you're seeing it right now, because as I'm making this screencast, President Trump has been busy undoing a lot of what President Obama wrote down that was not encoded into law. However, now because Lincoln has been reelected, I'm going to back up here a second, go back to the map. Because Lincoln has been reelected and all of these states reelected him, now the Congress feels like they can go ahead and write the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and it gets ratified pretty easily. Now let's remember, if all of those southern states had been still part of our country at that point in time, I think it would have been very problematic for the 13th Amendment to have been ratified. But because they are snatching the moment now, Lincoln has been reelected. Most people are anti-slavery, and even the border states are going to have to go along with this because we've got them outnumbered. Lincoln's been reelected. We're going to write the 13th Amendment. We are going to push it through and get it ratified. And then no matter what happens from now on, there will be no more slavery in this country forever.